You ever notice how some rooms feel heavy the moment you step into them, like the walls themselves are holding their breath? That's where we begin. In a dim, cramped medical chamber buried deep inside Windsor Castle, where the air is thick with the smell of iron and panic. A single oil lamp flickers on a wooden table, throwing long, trembling shadows across the floor. And right in the center of it all, a doctor stands frozen. His hands shake as he wipes blood from his gloves, not just from the effort of a procedure gone wrong, but from the fear of what happens next. He keeps glancing at the corner of the room, where two royal agents stand like statues, faces unreadable, eyes sharp, waiting for orders. No one speaks. No one dares. The tension in that small room feels alive, almost aware of its own importance. And you're there too, hidden, unseen, standing just behind a thick velvet curtain as if history itself has allowed you a glimpse into a moment you were never meant to witness. You can feel the weight of the secret pressing in from all sides, wrapping around you like cold fabric. Because whatever happened on that table, whatever left the doctor trembling, whatever forced those agents to watch in silence, it wasn't ordinary. It wasn't expected. And it wasn't something the crown could ever allow the world to know. Then, from somewhere behind you, a voice, low and firm, cuts through the room like a blade. Lock the doors. Not a word leaves this room. And just like that, the chamber stops being a place of healing and becomes a vault. A vault built to bury a prince's suffering so deep that history might never uncover it. This is where the nightmare truly begins. The door bolts slide into place, and the sound echoes through the chamber like a final verdict. In that instant, you can feel the shift, not just in the room but in the entire weight of the monarchy pressing down on this single moment. What lies on that table, whatever broke the calm of Windsor Castle tonight, isn't something they can explain away with polite announcements or carefully crafted speeches. No, this is different. And here's the truth they'll never admit out loud. Prince Alfred's tragedy wasn't some gentle decline, or a quiet illness tucked between the lines of royal records. It was a catastrophe, raw, humiliating, impossible for the world to see without tearing at the very image the crown depended on. A moment so damaging that the monarchy didn't just hide it, they built a fortress of silence around it. Because a royal family lives on reputation. One crack in the facade can spread like wildfire. One whispered scandal can unravel years of carefully shaped power. So the people in that room aren't just protecting a prince, they're protecting the story the empire tells about itself. The story that millions believe without question. And as you stand in the shadows, watching them scramble to contain something they can barely even name, you understand the stakes as clearly as they do. If the truth escapes this room, it won't just rewrite a chapter of history, it will expose how fragile the royal world truly is. To understand why this moment became so dangerous, you have to go back to where Alfred's story truly began, long before locked doors and trembling doctors. Back to a childhood lived under ceilings far too high, and expectations far too heavy for any young boy to carry. Alfred was born into a world where every breath a royal child took was measured, judged, and compared. And from the very beginning, he lived in the long shadow of two towering figures, Queen Victoria, whose authority was absolute, and Prince Albert, whose vision for his sons was carved from discipline and duty. In a family of 9 there were favorites, prodigies, political heirs, and then there was Alfred. The child often mentioned last, the one who slipped between the more celebrated personalities of his siblings. Not unloved, but unnoticed in ways that leave quiet marks on a young heart. He grew up watching his brothers groomed for diplomacy, rulership, prestige. Alfred, meanwhile, was steered firmly toward the Navy, a world of rigid structure and unbroken obedience. Albert believed discipline would sharpen him. Victoria believed duty would strengthen him. Neither quite saw that their son was straining under the weight of both. Even as a boy, Alfred carried a subtle, restless ache, the kind that comes from trying to become what everyone else expects while losing sight of who you are. He smiled when he was meant to. He saluted when he was told to. He learned to stand straight even when he wanted to collapse. But behind those polished boots and perfect manners were the early signs of a child stretching himself too thin, moments when the cheerful prince grew quiet, when his confidence faltered, when his eyes drifted somewhere far away, as if searching for space to breathe. He wasn't weak. He wasn't dramatic. He was simply a young boy trapped in a life designed by others, with no room for mistakes, no room for softness, and absolutely no room for being ordinary. And that quiet pressure, constant and invisible, would follow him into adulthood, until the day it finally broke him. As Alfred grew older, the palace found a way to polish him into something the world could applaud. And for a time it worked. When he entered the navy, something in him seemed to click, almost as if the sea offered a freedom the palace never could. He threw himself into the work with a determination that surprised even his strictest instructors. Promotions came quickly. Medals followed. And before long, Alfred wasn't just another royal son. He was a rising star. Foreign courts adored him. Sailors respected him. Common people cheered for him with a warmth royals rarely received. For a brief, shining moment, Alfred became exactly what Queen Victoria had always hoped one of her sons would be: a symbol of strength, honor, and a future worthy of the empire. Newspapers praised his discipline. Diplomats praised his charm. Even Albert's old friends remarked that Alfred carried a spark they hadn't expected. This was the golden period of his life. The chapter people remembered, the chapter the crown preferred to keep in the light. But while the world celebrated his achievements, small cracks began to form beneath the surface. Tiny fractures only those closest to him noticed. There were days when he returned from patrol quieter than usual, when his temper flared without warning, when he avoided gatherings meant to honor him. He began drifting at formal events, answering questions with a distant nod, as though his mind was trapped somewhere he couldn't explain. Royal protocol tightened around him like a rope, polished appearances, perfect posture, endless expectations. And the more the empire embraced him, the more isolated he seemed to feel. He was becoming the pride of the nation, yes. But behind the applause, Alfred was slowly losing the part of himself that had once kept him steady. The golden light around him was bright, so bright that no one noticed the shadows growing just behind it. But every rise has a moment where the ground shifts, quietly at first, then all at once. For Alfred, that moment arrived in the form of one incident the palace would later describe only as unfortunate. A vague word, polished, harmless, nothing like the truth. It began with a choice he was never supposed to make. Some say it was a duel sparked by wounded pride. Others whisper about a forbidden affair that spiraled beyond control. And a few, close enough to feel the tremors, believed it was the sudden collapse of a mind stretched too far for too long. Whichever version you follow, the result was the same. A prince, once steady, disciplined, admired, stumbled in a way no royal heir was ever allowed to stumble. And the palace felt the shock immediately. Not because Alfred had fallen, but because the world might find out how he fell. The monarchy didn't fear injury or illness. Those could be managed. Those could be explained. What they feared was humiliation. Anything that might crack the perfect surface they spent decades polishing. Within hours, doctors were rushed in. Letters stopped leaving the castle. Alfred's name disappeared from scheduled events with no explanation. And behind closed doors, the word illness began circulating. Spoken softly, shaped carefully, like a shield meant to hide something far more complicated. But this wasn't an illness of the body alone. It was reputational. Political. A threat to the narrative that held the monarchy together. Alfred had become unstable in the one place the crown could least afford weakness, its public image. And from that moment on, the royal household's priority shifted. No longer focused on helping him, but on containing him. Because a sick prince can be treated. A disgraced one must be erased. The moment Alfred became a liability, the palace moved with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, like they'd trained for this kind of disaster but prayed they'd never need it. What followed unfolded in 4 quiet, calculated stages. Not experiments, but containment. The first step was silence. One morning Alfred's name simply vanished from the public schedule. No explanation. No statement. Just absence. Servants were reassigned. Hallway routes were changed. Anyone who worked near him was pulled aside and reminded, in carefully chosen words, what loyalty to the crown meant. Letters he tried to send never reached their destination. Letters addressed to him were intercepted before they touched his hands. The world outside moved as usual, balls, banquets, ceremonies, while Alfred's world shrank to a single wing of the castle. A prince still living under a royal roof but already being erased from it. Then came the stories, crafted, polished, and distributed like medicine meant to soothe the restless public. Newspapers received gentle guidance through trusted channels. Alfred was described as resting, recovering, needing time after naval service. Harmless words with soft edges. Meanwhile, when the palace needed to show him in good health, they didn't dare bring him forward. Instead, they pulled out older portraits, photographs taken before the trouble began, and released them again as if they were new. Inside the palace, his condition became a bruise no one was allowed to mention. A forbidden topic. A shadow everyone stepped around. It wasn't a lie they told themselves. Just a better version of the truth. But secrets are hard to control. And people are harder. As Alfred's state worsened, advisors tightened access around him like a closing fist. Visitors were screened, postponed, or turned away entirely. Even his siblings, those closest to him, were kept at a distance, often told, "Not today. His condition is delicate." Doctors whispered among themselves, arguing over treatment with one eye always on the possibility of Victoria's anger. No one wanted to be the one blamed for failing her son. No one wanted their career, or their life, ruined by a misstep. And Alfred, he felt the walls closing in. He noticed the locked doors, the missing letters, the sudden quiet around his name. The realization sank in slowly, painfully. He was being hidden. Not protected, hidden. And that began to break him more than any illness ever could. When his condition slipped beyond what polite words could disguise, the palace moved into its harshest phase. Personal items were gathered and removed. Notes he had written were seized. Whole journals, pages filled with his thoughts, fears, maybe even confessions, were burned before they could be read by the wrong hands. Senior courtiers met in guarded rooms to decide how history would remember him. Not as he truly was, but as the monarchy needed him to be. A new version of Alfred was drafted, clean, dignified, untroubled. A prince who lived with quiet grace and died with gentle dignity. A story that never existed, but one that would be told for generations. And with every document destroyed, every detail softened, every truth buried, the real Alfred, the troubled, brilliant, fragile young man, began to disappear from the world long before his body ever did. What began as a family crisis soon turned into something far colder, something far larger than Alfred himself. The palace, once a home filled with footsteps and chatter, hardened into a fortress built on silence. It happened slowly at first. A few extra guards in the hallway. A few whispered warnings to staff. A few doors that were suddenly kept locked at all hours. But within weeks, Buckingham and Windsor were no longer palaces. They were sealed chambers of control. Maids who once hummed while changing linens now lowered their voices if anyone walked by. Guards avoided eye contact, unsure who was listening. Valets, footmen, and kitchen boys learned to measure every word, every expression, every breath. Because in this new version of the royal household, any worker could accidentally reveal too much. And any worker who revealed too much could be dismissed, punished, or quietly relocated to a post so distant it might as well have been exile. Fear spread faster than any illness. Servants began watching their colleagues not out of spite but out of survival, making sure no one seemed too curious, too talkative, too concerned about Alfred's disappearance. Even friendships that had lasted years grew strained, frayed by the pressure of secrets no one was allowed to name. And the most unsettling part? The system operated almost without direction. Queen Victoria didn't need to bark orders or hover over every detail. Her presence, her expectations, were enough. The courtiers beneath her understood the consequences of failure. They understood that the reputation of the monarchy mattered more than the suffering of one son. So the machinery kept turning on its own. Files were tucked away. Servants were reshuffled. Stories were polished before they reached her desk. And anything that didn't fit the official narrative simply vanished. By then, Alfred was no longer just a prince in crisis. He had become the center of a vast, humming network of silence. A silence so powerful, so efficient, that it didn't even need the Queen's direct command to survive. It had become its own creature. A beast made of whispers and locked doors, one that would swallow every truth in its path. Outside the palace walls, life in the empire moved forward as if nothing had changed. But the silence surrounding Alfred didn't stay contained. It spread outward, carried by rumor, by instinct, and by the empire's own need to believe in a perfect crown. The British public never received the truth, but they unknowingly helped bury it. People were taught, almost conditioned, to see the royal family as spotless symbols of stability. So when Alfred suddenly vanished from public life, most didn't question it. They accepted the gentle explanations, the polished updates, the vague assurances that he was resting or traveling. Not because the answers were convincing, but because questioning the monarchy felt like questioning the empire itself. Newspapers, sensing the mood of the nation and the unspoken pressure of palace influence, stepped carefully. Editors avoided controversy like it was poison. Columnists wrote around Alfred's absence using phrases that meant everything and nothing: indisposed, recovering, in need of private time. It wasn't journalism. It was cooperation, quiet, willing, and convenient. And beyond Britain's shores, foreign courts received clear instructions. When hosting British diplomats, they were told politely, but firmly, not to inquire about the Queen's second son. Any curiosity was labeled disrespectful. Any gossip was treated as an insult to an entire empire. So kingdoms and duchies, eager to maintain alliances, played along. They bowed, they smiled, and they let the subject drop. And slowly, something subtle began to take hold across the empire. A kind of shared denial, a collective agreement to pretend there was no mystery, no scandal, no tragedy unfolding in royal corridors. People didn't just avoid the truth. They learned to unsee it. They folded Alfred into the same quiet category reserved for all royal secrets, the things everyone senses but no one dares to speak aloud. And with every month that passed, the silence around him grew thicker, until the world wasn't just unaware of the truth, it no longer wanted to know it. But in every system built on silence, there is always one person who can no longer bear the weight of what they've seen. In Alfred's story, that person was not a soldier, nor a courtier chasing influence. It was a private secretary, a quiet, observant man whose job had always been to write what others told him to write. He had served Alfred for years, long before the trouble began. He knew the prince's handwriting, his moods, his habits, and he knew the difference between a man who was ill and a man who was being erased. At first he followed orders like everyone else. He delivered sealed messages. He escorted visitors away with polite excuses. He watched as Alfred's world grew smaller, one locked door at a time. But eventually duty turned into doubt. He saw Alfred's confusion deepen. He saw the fear in his eyes when another letter disappeared before he could send it. He saw the exhaustion in the young man who once smiled his way through naval inspections and public tours. And something inside him broke. Late at night, when the corridors were empty and the palace slept, the secretary began writing, not official reports, not polished statements, but the truth. Private notes. Observations. Moments he couldn't let vanish into the darkness the way everything else had. He hid them between pages of unrelated ledgers, tucked them behind loose stones in his quarters, folded them inside books no one else would dare touch. He wrote about the day Alfred stopped asking questions, the day he realized no answers would be given. He wrote about the trembling hands, the pleading looks, the flashes of clarity swallowed by despair. These secret records became the only honest account of Alfred's missing years, a quiet rebellion written in ink instead of defiance. And the secretary knew the risk. He knew that if anyone discovered what he was doing, he would lose everything. His position, his livelihood, maybe even his life. But the more the palace tightened its grip, the more he felt something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. Not to the crown, but to the truth. And without realizing it, he planted the seed that would survive long after every official report was burned or rewritten. A seed that, decades later, would grow into the first cracks in the palace's perfect narrative. Because history may forget thousands of lies, but it never forgets the one person who dared to write down what really happened. And then came the night when everything the palace feared finally happened. Alfred's condition, held together for months by secrecy and desperation, collapsed in a way no locked door or polished statement could conceal. His breathing faltered. His strength vanished. And the young man who once stood proudly on the deck of a naval ship could barely lift his head from the pillow. The alarm spread through Windsor Castle in hushed, frantic whispers. Doctors were summoned from their beds. Footsteps echoed down the corridors like distant thunder. Every servant who still worked in Alfred's wing felt the shift, the sense that the situation had slipped beyond control. And with that realization came panic. Royal agents swarmed the prince's quarters, not to comfort him, but to protect the monarchy from the fallout they had long feared. Documents were seized. Letters swept into trunks. Portraits removed from walls. Anything that hinted at vulnerability, instability, or disgrace was gathered with ruthless precision. The palace was no longer hiding a scandal. It was erasing the final traces of a life. Inside the family, tensions cracked wide open. Some begged for compassion, for Alfred to be treated not as a threat, but as a son who had suffered far more than anyone understood. Others insisted that protecting the crown mattered above all, that any sign of weakness could tarnish the dynasty for generations. In that tug-of-war between mercy and preservation, Alfred lay caught in the middle, fading quietly as the world he once belonged to argued over how he should be remembered. His final hours were not peaceful. They were rushed, guarded, and heavy with fear, not fear of death but fear of exposure. The secretary who had documented everything stood just outside the door, listening to the muffled chaos, realizing that the truth was slipping further away by the minute. He watched royal agents carry out boxes of papers, watched doctors lower their eyes, watched courtiers rehearse the explanation they would give the public. And when Alfred finally drew his last breath, the palace fell into an eerie, suffocating stillness. Not grief, not mourning, just the heavy silence of power resetting itself. Outside, the empire slept unaware. Inside, the monarchy reshaped the story before the body was even cold. Because if there was one moment they wished the world would never discover, it was this one. The night a prince died not surrounded by love, but swallowed by the silence that had been built to hide him. When dawn broke over Windsor, the palace wasted no time sealing the story into something neat, soft, and safe. The announcement to the public was brief, so brief you could almost read between the lines and see the fear behind it. His Royal Highness has passed after a period of declining health. A single sentence. No explanation. No details. Just a polished veil placed over a night filled with chaos. There was no grand funeral procession. No full military honors fit for a son of Queen Victoria. Instead, the ceremony felt restrained. Smaller than expected. Shorter than tradition demanded. Almost as if the monarchy feared that too much attention might invite too many questions. Inside the palace archives, his life was quietly edited. Documents were rearranged. Timelines adjusted. Personal correspondence removed entirely. Official biographers, those trusted with shaping royal memory, were handed a version of Alfred's life that had been carved clean of anything inconvenient. The palace had rewritten the prince before the world even had time to grieve him. But behind closed doors, the family itself unraveled. Arguments broke out in quiet rooms that had once hosted laughter. Some blamed the secrecy. Others blamed the pressure. A few dared to whisper the truth, that Alfred's suffering had been made worse by the very machine meant to protect the crown. And at the center of it all stood Queen Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, a mother who had buried yet another child, and a ruler who refused to write a single clear word about him in her diary. On the very week her son died, the pages are empty. No reflections. No anguish. No record of what she knew or what she felt. Just silence. The same silence that had swallowed Alfred in life now wrapped itself around his memory, tight, unyielding, deliberate. A royal death without closure. A mother's grief hidden from history. And a young man's truth folded into the quiet spaces the monarchy hoped the world would never look into. In the years that followed Alfred's death, the palace tried to move forward as though nothing had shattered within its walls. But absence has a way of reshaping everything it leaves behind. Without Alfred, the balance among Victoria's remaining children shifted in uncomfortable ways. Some of them stepped into new responsibilities they were never meant to hold. Others withdrew, carrying a quiet guilt that came from surviving what their brother could not. Family gatherings changed. There was a tension, a stiffness, as if everyone felt the outline of a missing presence they were forbidden to name. And the monarchy, it learned a lesson. Not a moral one, a strategic one. Alfred's tragedy showed the royal household exactly how effective silence could be. How easily a scandal could be contained. How completely a person could be erased if enough hands worked together to make it happen. From that point onward, secrecy didn't just protect the crown, it defined it. Whenever another royal misstep appeared, the same blueprint quietly unfolded. Tight control of information, careful manipulation of public sympathy, a polished narrative replacing the messy truth underneath. It became routine. Expected. Almost professional. Meanwhile, the psychological wounds Alfred left behind spread through the family like an echo that refused to fade. Some of his siblings, already raised under enormous pressure, began to feel the weight of what had happened in ways they couldn't express. There was the guilt, the question of whether any of them could have done more, said more, noticed more. But guilt inside a royal family is dangerous, so they did what the palace had always taught them. They hid it. Courtiers too learned their own lesson. They discovered how powerful silence could be, how it kept them employed, protected their futures, and elevated their influence. They learned that speaking too openly was risky, but burying the truth could make you indispensable. And so Alfred's story didn't just disappear. It left a blueprint in its wake, a quiet, careful, unspoken guide for every royal scandal that would follow. A guide built from fear, perfected through repetition, and cemented by the memory of a prince who never got to speak for himself. And the most revealing part of Alfred's legacy isn't sealed in the past at all. It's here, woven quietly into the way modern royalty presents itself to the world. If you look closely at today's royal PR machinery, you can still see the fingerprints of Alfred's suppression on its gears. The careful smiles. The rehearsed gestures. The flawless photographs released at just the right moment. These aren't accidents. They're the descendants of tactics perfected in the era when a single prince's suffering had to be hidden at all costs. The media filters we take for granted, the stories trimmed, softened, or delayed, follow the same rhythm that once protected Queen Victoria's household. Curated appearances, where every angle and every expression is managed with almost military precision, echo the days when Alfred's real condition was disguised behind older portraits. Even the controlled leaks, small bits of information that appear to offer transparency while hiding the most uncomfortable truths, are nothing new. They are simply modern tools built on Victorian foundations, give the public enough to feel informed, but never enough to understand. Reputation triage, managing scandals by shaping the narrative before the facts settle, was born in the very halls where Alfred's letters were burned and his journals destroyed. And today, without even realizing it, we participate in the same cycle the empire once did. We accept the stories we're handed. We applaud the polished image. We rarely stop to question the silence behind the curtain. Which leaves us with a question far heavier than it appears. Do we truly know our royals today, or only the version we're permitted to see? And if you drift back, just for a moment, to that first scene inside the dim medical chamber, you can feel the truth settle in. Not the truth written in reports, not the truth spoken at royal funerals, but the truth that hung in the air the night a trembling doctor whispered for the doors to be locked. Silence filled that room. Thick, deliberate, suffocating. And that silence didn't end when Alfred's heartbeat faded. It stretched outward, wrapping itself around his memories, his mistakes, his pain, until the man he truly was disappeared beneath the story the monarchy chose instead. Because sometimes silence does more harm than any scandal. Sometimes the things never spoken leave deeper scars than the ones shouted across nations. Prince Alfred didn't simply die. His life was folded, edited, and quietly removed, piece by piece, so the throne could remain untouched. And the most haunting part is this. Hidden history never really dies. It lingers, in the empty pages of a queen's diary, in the questions left unanswered, in the shadows behind perfectly framed royal portraits. It waits for someone to notice. And now that you've seen the cracks in the story, now that you've looked behind the velvet curtain, there's only one truth left standing. A prince wasn't lost to illness. He was erased to protect a crown.